Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And this is the 1-year anniversary. Today, I'm going to cast this forward. February 15th is the 1-year anniversary of the Texas Blackouts. On that day, here in Austin, my wife Lauren and I were blacked out starting at 2 a.m. for 45 hours. So we wanted to revisit the issues of reliability, grids, RTOs, and the future of electricity with who else would be better to discuss these issues than my guest, Meredith Angwin. She is the author of the book, Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. Meredith, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Delighted to be back. I always enjoy talking to you, Robert.
So, you know, this is the record-setting Meredith Angwin. This is the 4th time you've been on the Power Hungry Podcast. We did one on the 1-year anniversary, and we had you on for the 3rd time because I think you were the most popular guest we'd had up to that time. Wow. So you're still one of our most popular guests in all of the 160,000 downloads that we've had so far or so to this point. But Meredith, you've been on the show before. I'm still going to have you introduce yourself. I gave the name of the title of your book. Imagine nobody knows who you are, and you've arrived somewhere. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Meredith Angwin, and by training and by my career, mostly I'm a physical chemist, and I work mostly on utility projects such as pollution control and corrosion control in many different kinds of plants, nuclear, geothermal, and fossil, all of them. And then when I moved in semi-retirement, I moved to Vermont Yankee. But I moved to Vermont and I began fighting for the continuation of Vermont Yankee. And there were all these people who were like, if we shut down Vermont Yankee, we're going to have all these renewables. Well, I had worked in renewables and I had also worked in nuclear. And I had a very clear idea that if we shut down Vermont Yankee, we would have more fossil. Not that fossil is the end of the world, but I mean, these people were like, no, it'll be so clean. So anyway, I began campaigning to keep Vermont Yankee open. And in doing that, I ended up with a blog about Vermont Yankee. And that blog led me to realize that Vermont Yankee was part of a grid. Now, I always knew it was part of a grid, but you have to understand that if you're a materials person, you don't spend a lot of time wondering how the grid is being governed. But all of a sudden, I had to begin thinking about that because I would read headlines in the paper or notes about Vermont Yankee, and I would be like, oh, not allowed to delist from forward capacity auction. What does that mean? I mean, it wasn't something that was immediately obvious to me. And so anyhow, I began writing about the grid, and then some people who were in a group, the consumer liaison group that advised the grid operator, asked me to join. And anyway, so I joined. I began finding out a lot more about the grid and how it operates. And then I decided that nobody knows how it operates. It's almost like a black box. And the decisions that are made in closed rooms have huge effects on our lives. So I wrote the book, Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. I really began to realize that people weren't taking care of the reliability the way they should, and that there was actually incentives for a non-reliable grid in the sense that the power plants get paid better when the grid is at the edge of difficulties.
Right. Well, that's a great way to talk about what happened in Texas and a year ago, where the ERCOT grid came to the precipice of total meltdown and potentially going to a black start situation. So I know you live in New England, but I know you've also been following what's happened in Texas. What's happened over the last year? Are you encouraged by the policy moves that have occurred since in the intervening 12 months? And is the Texas grid more stable or more reliable, more resilient than it was a year ago?
Well, from what I can tell about the Texas grid, they have done some winterizing, but not as much as they should. And as a matter of fact, when they modeled it, I mean, if you want to look at a good article on it. There was a New York Times article around December 20th of last year, which was really a good article. And basically it said what I'd been reading in more technical things, that when they were modeling, can we get through the winter, they decided not to model the situation that had happened on February 15th of that year. They decided, no, that's such an extreme situation. We're not going to model that. And of course, if they had, it would be like, oh, actually, if the same thing happened again, we wouldn't be able to get through the winter. But by leaving it off, they were like, wow, we've improved things and things are much better and we'll get through the winter, assuming that thing doesn't come back.
Sure. Well, so you're an expert on RTOs. This is where you've been living for a while, and it's something that I think has really come to the fore about what ERCOT is and how it functions. Is the RTO model just fundamentally flawed? I mean, it seems to me that that's one of the things we've been arguing around. And is there, if it is fatally flawed, what's the way forward?
Well, I think it is fatally flawed, but that is because there is no place in it where somebody is accountable for grid reliability. There are various kinds of responsibility for grid reliability. There's a NERC will do your operator training and has rules about how you run your distribution system and substations. And ISO New England tries to keep things going on a daily basis and do some planning. But if you ask ISO New England, what plants would you like to see or what would you like to ban? They would say, oh, I'm sorry, resource adequacy, what plants are on the line, that's the state's business. And if you ask the states, well, the states are responsible for resource adequacy, not us. And then if you ask the states, they would say, well, yes, we are responsible for resource adequacy, but you understand we can plan something, but when you get right down to it, if it doesn't clear the auctions in ISO, it's not likely to happen. So I consider, as a state, I consider that the ISO is responsible for resource adequacy. So you see, the thing is that everybody has some responsibility, but since nobody's accountable, since nobody has all the responsibility, it's just a chance for everybody to point fingers and have lawsuits. And I gather you're having quite a few of those in Texas.
Well, that would be the understatement so far. There are I had a piece in Forbes a little while ago, 131 insurers have sued ERCOT and the generators. I don't have a final tally of all the personal injury cases, but it's, what do they call it? The MDL, the multi-district litigation that's now been consolidated in Houston for all the personal injury and cases. And then, of course, there's the bankruptcy litigation around Griddy and more particularly around Brazos Electric Brazos Electric Cooperative. So, the amount of money at stake here is just massive. In addition to the costs that consumers in the state are going to have to bear because of these securitized costs. But let's talk about that, because you and I talked on the phone a while back when I was working on this issue of insurance and litigation. ERCOT is claiming sovereign immunity from all of this litigation. I'll ask the question directly. So is the RTO a sovereign entity? Is it part of the state? What is it?
I don't know what it is. And I'm going to tell you that I think it defines itself depending on what it wants to do. But in the meantime, Connecticut recently had a forum on grid reliability. Connecticut is a state. It didn't have. The Connecticut legislature has two houses, Senate and House, and they each have a energy committee. Okay, and those two houses' energy committees got together and held this forum on grid reliability, and because they are concerned with it, and they have every reason to be concerned, because, as I said at the beginning of my book, we become dependent on oil and on LNG deliveries here to keep our grid operating in the winter, and those are both rather rather touchy, just in time, and who knows situations. So at any rate, the Connecticut legislature held this meeting, and I was the first speaker. And then the second speaker was Gordon Van Wiley of
ISO New England.
ISO New England. Yeah. Now the thing about Gordon's talk is, he said what I would have expected him to say in general, and but it was very interesting when we were supposed to, each of us was supposed to talk for about 20 minutes, and we did, and the other 40 minutes or so was for the different committee members to ask us questions, and so we had a bunch of questions. Well, Gordon began to ask some questions, and he says, well, you understand we're not a regulator. You can't, we're not responsible that way like a regulator. We are like an LLC. We're like another utility. And I said, oh, really? Who would have guessed? But I mean, this is, you have to understand, I don't pretend to be a lawyer. I got good enough at, for example, reading a FERC, ruling to get an idea of what was going on. But I mean, my background is absolutely material science, utilities, and so forth. So if you ask me exactly what defines a utility and whether is ISO New England a regulator, they make many decisions that are similar to what a regulator might make. They decide, for example, they have to make a decision. If there's a whole bunch of wind turbines that want to get into the interconnection queue, they may or may not let them all in, not mainly on the basis of whether the lines in the area the turbines are proposed are adequate or they need to be built out later. So these are all decisions that if it was a little state without an RTO, those decisions would be made by the PUC. The PUC might say to the wind turbines, actually, you can get on in 3-4 years, but first we're going to do a build out of the transmission. Or they might say the build out of transmission to that neck of the woods, too expensive, sorry. Right. But they would be regulators in that way. They would be stop or go. But Gordon Van Wiley said, we're not a regulator. You can't. And so someone was asking, well, how come the states can't affect the ISO New England decisions? I said that the elected officials are rarely part of any group that is involved in the ISO New England decisions. And as a matter of fact, the governors have been really kind of in a rebellious mood about not having a seat at the table about electricity decisions. And, so ISO New England said, well, we're not a regulator. And so someone said, well, who do we call? And who do we tell?
Well, this sounds exactly
who's the person?
Right.
Who's the group? And the answer, Gordon Van Wiley's answer was, and it's the correct answer. I mean, he's a smart man. He said, FERC. FERC holds open hearings. FERC holds ask for input on a coming ruling. You can send in an email. You can send in a letter. You can go to FERC. Well, FERC is like in Fiddler on the Roof. That somebody says, "What's a blessing for the czar?" And the answer is, "Lord, bless and keep the czar far away from us." And then there's the Russian saying, "God is too high and the czar is too far." Nobody's going to help. But what I'm saying is that I really think that go to a big agency in Washington, D.C., and they'll answer your concerns. I mean, I don't think that's the way to do it. I mean,
if I can interrupt here, because what comes to mind as you're saying this, Meredith, is that what I've been thinking about and actually talking about in my speaking engagements, that after the meltdown at ERCOT, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. Right, that there's the ERCOT is just saying, well, as one person told me, well, no, they're just kind of a state-sponsored cooperative, but they're not. But ERCOT doesn't get any state appropriations. They don't get any money from the state. They collect it from the market players, right? But they're regulated by the state and directed by the state. But does that make them a part of the state? And so I think the court decisions on this sovereign immunity question are really going to be important, because if the state says, if the courts say, no, you don't deserve sovereign immunity, who's going to pay? Well, it's going to be the consumer, of course.
Well, the consumer is going to pay whether ERCOT gets off the hook or not, because there is no source of big money for these kind of things except the consumer. If somebody makes it, even something that's really something good, like we're going to start a big energy efficiency program in this state, and people are going to be able to get their houses set up for winter, and it's all going to be underwritten. Who's going to end up paying for it? It's the consumers. I mean, you can say, well, no, the utilities will pay. They're unlikely to be taking it out of their profits to run this program for the state.
You said unlikely? Yes, unlikely. It is not going to happen, is the short answer. It's going to happen.
It's going to be another expense that the utilities pass on to the consumers. And there's a fantasy somehow that these big organizations have tons of money to do these things. No, they're taking our money, your money, whatever. But you understand, your sovereign immunity question is a really interesting one, because you are at least a state. What I'm trying to say is the state either has given ERCOT a position which it has sovereign immunity or it doesn't. We're multiple states. And so you can say, well, it's just a consortium. It's like a co-op. I mean, it's like a dairy co-op. It's like Cabot Creamery.
Oh, right. Well, that's a good point, too, because your point, you said, Van Wiley said, well, go, his reference was, well, if we have a problem, we'll go talk to FERC. Well, in Texas, because ERCOT is not interconnected, not regulated by FERC. So there's no go talk to FERC excuse here. This is the buck. Again, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. And that's why this could be the Lawyer Full Employment Act here for the next few years on sorting out the liability in the 1 year. Well, now we're at 1 year and counting in the wake of the blackouts that, depending on whose math you believe, 70 billion, 130 billion, 200 billion, 700 people dead. I mean, the costs here are just staggering.
Yes, they are staggering. And I will say that you aren't subject to FERC in many ways, and certainly about this financial stuff, but you are subject in other ways, because there are FERC regulations on safety and stuff that are for every power plant and transmission system. I mean, you don't really run into them very much. I don't know much about them. All I'll say is that, I wrote something about the Texas Blackouts, and I said, nobody's responsible for reliability. And someone says, I work at NERC and we're responsible for reliability. And somebody else answers, said, look, you don't use the word reliability the same way ordinary people do. Ordinary people say it's reliable if I can turn the lights on. You use it as the bulk power system is operating as expected, or whatever, and the rules are being followed and so forth. And then he said, I encourage you to look up the NERC rules on reliability, and you won't see end users really being referenced.
Well, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up NERC, because it's one of the things that I've been looking at. Now, you were last on the Power Hungry podcast, I think in June of last year, June of 2021. And one of the things that's come out since we talked is the NERC ERO reliability risk ERO reliability risk priorities report in August 12th of last year. And it said that, I'm quoting here, America's electric generation capacity, quote, is increasingly characterized as one that is sensitive to extreme, widespread, and long duration temperatures, as well as wind and solar droughts. And then there's an amazing graphic where they show the risks and the high risks, low risks, and the highest risk, the number one highest risk issue they list there is changing resource mix. Yes. So here's NERC, which, and I'm glad you brought it up, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, identifying, as I read it, too much wind and too much solar as a reliability risk. It seems pretty plain to me how they're, they don't say it exactly that way, but the wind and solar, but these extended droughts on wind, that's what we're seeing in Europe, isn't it?
Yes, we are seeing that in Europe, and we can. The weather is an unpredictable thing. If you think about it, one of the problems is that California is in a drought. Now you may say, well, California, it's global warming, but I mean, it may be. But whether it is or not, California has had periodic droughts for a really long time, and so, California doesn't have the hydro it would like to have right now, I would like to say that in my book, In Shorting the Grid, I talked a lot about the different groups that are influencing the decisions made on the grid about resources and about payments and about how much renewables are on the grid, renewable portfolio standards, how renewables affect the grids, and all that. And I didn't write much about NERC, and I didn't write much about external market monitors. Every RTO has an external market monitor, and there is a lot of things with NERC that NERC says. But when you get right down to it, as far as I can tell, the market monitors are advisory. They write things, and then later on, after everything goes south, people will say, hey, the market monitor warned us about this. But if I put that in the book, I would have to do a research project called Market Monitors Don't Affect the Outcome. And I was like, I'm not ready for that research project. I've already got about 5 research projects putting this book together. I mean, it has 300 footnotes. I mean, it was a research project of a major kind, of years of research. So what I'm trying to say is there are things that are set up, the NERC and the external market monitors, that are supposed to be taking care of some of this, but they don't. They're basically advisory. And so
because they don't have any authority, there's no enforcement authority. And therein lies one of the key issues, I think, that I see so far in Texas. And I was on a panel with the next to Peter Lake, the new chairman of the Public Utility Commission. He said, well, we're enforcing these rules and the rest of it. But as I look at the ERCOT resource mix and what's in the queue to be connected, it's essentially all wind and solar, Meredith. I mean, if all of these projections are right, by the end of next year, the ERCOT grid could have more installed wind and solar than it has all types of natural gas fueled combustion and generation for open cycle, combined cycle, and reciprocating engines. I mean, the ERCOT grid seems like it's headed for yet more capacity for wind and solar, but no dispatchable thermal capacity. What do you make of that?
Why should you be different than the Northeast, huh? What's your problem? The Northeast grid. The Northeast grid is actually it's all wind, solar, batteries, and right. There's like 15,000 megawatts in the queue to be connected. Now, all of it won't be connected. It all doesn't get connected. These are all proposed. Right. But when you get right down to it, there's 800 or 900 megawatts of thermal. And the other 15,000 is either wind or solar or batteries.
Well, can any of that, let's talk about the siting issue, because, I care a lot about these land use conflicts, and I've been writing about them for a long time. But you're in Vermont. It's impossible to build wind in Vermont. I mean,
that's right.
Annette Smith is a mutual acquaintance of ours, and there are no wind projects pending in Vermont. And it's incredibly difficult to build any large scale renewable projects in all of New England. So, I mean, so that's an observation. What's the plausibility that they're going to build offshore wind in New England?
Well, it's pretty plausible, but it's if you pardon me saying so, it's a tremendous waste of money. I mean, the Block Island wind turbines went in, but they haven't been really performing up to snuff. And if you get into conversations with people who know a lot about about reliability and stuff, they're like, what are these people thinking? Don't they know that salt water is very corrosive, and that if you put something in salt water in the windiest place possible, that this is not going to be good for it? I mean, there's a limit to material science. I'm not saying we've hit the limits, but for example, if you have a heat engine, the higher the temperature of the hot side of the heat engine, and anything can be, your car is a heat engine, a gas turbine is a heat engine, a nuclear plant is a heat engine, a jet is a heat engine. They all run by the fact that heat gets turned into mechanical work. So if you the rules for heat engines is that the highest temperature on the hot side is one of the biggest determinations of efficiency. Well, at some point you can't get temperatures any higher because you'd melt all the metal. I mean, there are limits that the world puts on what we can do, and in my opinion, putting delicately balanced structures out in the ocean to be blasted by as high wind as possible is not a situation for longevity.
Well, so why does this get why does this get so much hype? Because there is a staggering amount of hype around by the governors of the various northeastern states, the New England states saying, oh, in New Jersey, Massachusetts, oh, we're going to build tens of gigawatts of offshore wind. Why is this notion so popular?
Well, the notion is popular because many people in New England really want us to be, quote, clean, to have lots and lots of renewables. And then the renewables run into trouble. They run into trouble. You can't site them, you can't build them, and you've got this problem with them and that problem with them. If nobody wants them in my backyard, you put them offshore, then you have your list of renewables, and we're going to be really clean and green. Yeah, lovely, clean and green. But, in other words, it's all a matter of trying to avoid putting renewables where someone will object to them. Another thing is that in general, if you want to build a cable connecting an offshore wind turbine to the shore, it is not as big a deal. Not as many people are going to fight that cable as are going to fight a transmission line onshore. So, if you put some wind turbines up in the White Mountains or in the foothills of the White Mountains, and then you had to put some transmission lines there, that'd be a big deal. But, as I say, there are many reasons where society wants wind turbines offshore. What I mean is people... Right. Out of sight, out of mind. Yeah, out of sight, out of mind, and look at all the great energy we're getting, but it isn't reasonable. I read something really depressing recently, and it said that if you begin forgetting about solving the real problems in front of you and begin making up problems to throw your resources at, this isn't good. So, it's not a way for society to thrive. And
that's go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just thinking that we could build nuclear plants, okay, and they would be onshore, and they would provide a lot of power, and they could help society thrive. But there's no percentage in doing that compared to wind turbines, because first of all, people think wind is lovely, and in other words, a whole bunch of perceptions about wind turbines compared to nuclear. And somebody's going to say, "Oh, Meredith, come on, nuclear is so dangerous." Well, I could give you a whole list of all the reasons it's not so dangerous, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just saying that there are other options besides. There's even wind turbines onshore.
Sure.
if it wasn't impossible to build them. There's transmission lines from Quebec if we could ever put one in. You see, there's a lot of things like that. Though, if you pardon me saying one thing about transmission lines from Quebec,
Sure.
in recent months, when it's been very, very cold here and very, very cold in Quebec, Quebec has been importing power from Ontario in order to send the power to New England, because Quebec has a lot of people who are using resistance heating, electrical heating. And so when it's very, very cold, when we have a very cold snap, they can't actually provide everything to their people and to our people without importing. And this kind of worries me as a New Englander, because what I'm saying is like, okay, now they're doing that. Well, meanwhile, back in Ontario, the large nuclear plant Pickering is up for refurbishing. Well, I hope and I think that it's going to be refurbished and stay online. But what if it isn't? What if it isn't? Will Ontario still be able to export to Quebec in cold weather? And will New England get power from Quebec in cold weather? All of a sudden, here I am in New England, and I'm not worried about Pickering just because I like nuclear. I'm worried about it because it might be part of my winter reliability, whether that plant is running or not.
You know, as you're saying this, Meredith, a couple of things. I want to come back to the transmission issue and the White Mountains. But what you're describing is a short squeeze, right? That suddenly everyone's going to look around and say, well, we don't have enough. We need to get some more, right? But that was what happened in ERCOT, right? A short squeeze where there was an idea, we'll have all this capacity, but it wasn't available. But I want to shift to talk a little bit about Europe, because, our bias today was talking about what happened in Texas in the 1-year anniversary. But in the past year, what we've seen in Europe has been just remarkable, that the whole continent is in crisis. So you coined the term the fatal trifecta, the over-reliance on renewables, over-reliance on just-in-time gas, and over-reliance on imports. Does the fatal trifecta describe what's happening in Europe now?
Pretty much. You have to add some other things too, and that is that Europe has political issues that we don't have. In other words, people may not want a gas pipeline here, but nobody has anything against Pennsylvania. They're not saying, we don't want to be dependent on Pennsylvania. We're in New York, we can't be dependent on Pennsylvania. No, that doesn't happen. But on the other hand, if you're in Europe and you have the whole bloody history since at least 1870, people don't want to be dependent on Germany or Russia. I mean, they really don't. And it's wonderful that Europe has had peace, and I think it's wonderful. I mean, you can't even begin to think about how many people have died in Europe in the wars. And so, but while it has peace, people are still not willing to go like, we'll just hand it over to the Russians, we're handing over everything to the Germans. We'll depend on them. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, and that's an interesting point, because it's something I've thought about quite a lot in the last few days, and it's this particularly your issue about imports. And what about, the issue of energy security? And you and I've talked about this, and it's one of the things that's clear in the wake of the ERCOT, disaster, was that the plants that did the best, that had the most resilience during crunch time, were the plants that had on-site fuel. And that's, excuse me, a long way to get to the point where I'm saying, that what's critical, it seems, or increasingly clear to me, and your point on over-reliance on imports is part of this, is that if you want energy security, you damn well want that energy source to be close to you. You don't want it to be far away. And the further away it is, the more vulnerable you are. Does that make sense to you?
Oh, yes, it definitely does. It definitely does. And the best kinds of power plants do keep oil on site. Now, oil or coal or uranium. Uranium's the top best. But what I'm saying is the fuel on site is tremendously important and valuable. because whatever's going on, if you have fuel on site, it'll take you a while to run out of it. And that means that you have some options on how to get some more. Right. But if you are having fuel delivered just in time, like through a gas pipeline, then if there's a valve problem on the pipeline or a compressor problem on a pipeline, that happens fast and you don't have an option of what to do next. And even supplying oil to a gas plant, one of the things that Gordon Treadwiley was saying, which I hadn't really gotten into my head before, is that if you have to supply oil to a dual fuel plant, and you have to do it in real time, it's going to take 2 to 3 oil trucks per hour. And those oil trucks are pretty busy with home heating oil. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that even oil can be just in time if you're not storing it, which is why the winter reliability projects were so important. The ones I wrote about in my book and so forth were the ISO New England pay to have oil stored on site at the beginning of the winter.
Well, and that makes sense because too, I mean, if it's in the winter and it's crunch time, not only are those trucks going to be in demand to deliver to other locations, but the roads were going to probably be bad as well, right?
That's right.
And that's much more of a common occurrence in New England than it is here, say, in Austin, Texas. But that I hadn't thought about the just-in-time issue with fuel, with oil, but I know from because I've been in meetings, but in some utilities in Kansas are talking about having massive on-site diesel fuel available and large reciprocating engines to make sure that they have reliability because they're not going to go through this again. But that was the part about, I think it's important. So well, let me ask it this way. There's been a lot of criticism of the gas companies and particularly the big gas pipelines, Energy Transfer and Kinder Morgan and some of the others that made a killing during Winter Storm Uri. What's your take on that? I mean, was that just because they were in the right place at the right time? That because they were able to take advantage of the short squeeze? Who's to blame for that part of it?
Well, that's a very interesting question because if you're a classic economist, you might say, yeah, they made a killing, and because they made so much money, the new gas pipelines will go in to and then eventually everything will even out. The trouble is that a new gas pipeline isn't the same as everybody's buying apples and so new orchards are going in. Nobody will stop you from putting an apple orchard on your property, but a lot of people will stop a new gas pipeline. And so, to some extent, I think they were just taking advantage of the fact that gas prices were just skyrocketing because everybody wanted it.
Well, yeah, fair enough. I mean, there's no doubt. But the other thing that occurs to me as you say that was there's an old saw, and maybe you've heard this before in the utility business. It's easier to move molecules than electrons.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, can you explore that, or are you familiar with that expression?
I'm familiar with the statement, but I don't have enough background in it to really explore it a lot because the thing is, if you're in New England, you can't move either. Okay, you can't build the pipeline, you can't build the transmission line. So from my point of view, it's no easier to move this than that. But I will say that to some extent, moving molecules is easier because, we couldn't import electricity from Tobago, but we can import LNG. We can't import electricity from
from Russia, but you can bring in oil or somewhere,
right,
yeah,
exactly.
Or Saudi Arabia, right? Yeah. Well, let me talk about that, about the moving electrons, because you mentioned transmission lines, and transmission lines are very hard to build. Now, there was a lot of talk in Texas, and of course, about the building of the CREZ lines to accommodate wind and the big growth in wind in Texas, and the cost was, I don't know, $7 billion, $10 billion, something like that. But it's almost well, you mentioned the White Mountains before, and New York wanted to, and Massachusetts want to bring in hydropower from Quebec. But it was, I think, in 2018, the New Hampshire Siting Board turned down the project to move to put a transmission line through New Hampshire, and more specifically through the White Mountains in New Hampshire. So you said it yourself, you can't build anything in New England. What's the possibility that you're going to be able to build high voltage transmission to bring hydro from Canada into New England or New York?
Well, maybe into New York. Okay, but not into New England. It's just, I don't think it's going to happen. Everything we do, everything people do, I mean, they say, look, we're going to bring it. It's going to be a cable sunk in Lake Champlain, which goes down pretty far, pretty south, and then after that, it'll join up with existing transmission line. It's going to be okay.
Go into the Hudson River,
and it gets turned down anyway because it's like, oh, it's evil. It's evil. People are solving impossible problems because the problems are all in their head. I shouldn't put it that way. They're solving problems that make them feel virtuous to solve them. And they're not solving practical problems like how do we get the electricity? You see?
Well, is that then, as you're saying this, and I've finally gotten some solid numbers on transmission line capacity that's been built over the past decade or so, and it's minimal, right? And yes. Meanwhile, these high renewable scenarios are claiming, oh, well, we'll just double, triple the quality, the amount of high voltage transmission in the U.S., which is just nuts. I mean, it's just simply not going to happen. But am I right to think, well, if that's the case, if we can't build more high voltage transmission, well, that's a break on renewables, a big break on renewables, big build out of renewables. But it seems to me it means then that the only way forward, if we're serious about carbon, is putting more nuclear plants in, because we can put them and attack and connect them to existing transmission. Does that rhyme with what you think? True.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I think new nuclear connected to existing transmission, and to some extent, if you want to build a power plant of any kind, what I mean is like a nuclear plant or a coal plant or whatever. In general, you need a space, a body of water, and a railroad. Okay? I mean, except for a gas plant where you also need a pipeline. But what I mean is you can find that collection of things many, many places, and many places that would really like you to come and put a plant in that'll employ a couple hundred people and pay a lot for the school system and the taxes. Compared to that, transmission lines and pipelines are very, very hard. Very hard.
Well, so let me zip back. I know we're kind of bouncing around here, but I'm curious as well about what, I want to ask about shorting now, because now the book has been out almost a year and a half. Is that right?
I know. It's amazing. It seems like it was just yesterday that it got published.
Well, so I want to ask a personal question, because now you've been on the podcast now 4 times, which is, and I'm thrilled that you could do it, especially now on the 1-year anniversary of the Texas Blackouts. But could you have predicted that your life would take this kind of turn? I mean, because you're a grandmother, you're in your 70s, and now you've got a book that, by the way, I think I probably sold as many copies of your book as I've sold of mine, because I always talk about it.
Well, thank you. Let me thank you. You know that when I was giving a class at the little OSHA, which is kind of a extension program connected with Dartmouth College, and the 2 recommended books I had for the class was your book on the question of power and my book. Those were the 2 books I recommended, and I felt that the question of power book gives you a context worldwide for the use of electricity and what kind of systems are set up or not set up, like in Lebanon, to get electricity to consumers. And then my book is about how bad choices make a fragile grid. Yeah. Now, it is a little amazing to me, but the thing is that I I really wrote it because I felt it was something people needed to know about. I would hear all these conversations about renewables or how we got to build this or how we have to afford that. And I thought, wow, I mean, how's that going to work at the auctions? And I would say that, and they'd go like, huh? There are auctions around. So what I'm saying is that I felt that people, in order to make good decisions about the grid, had to really think about what's going on with the auctions and the RTO areas.
But I wanted to come back to you, personally, because I know, I looked at the book before you published it, and I was, but now all these many months later, is this your third career, fourth career? Could you have predicted it? I mean, it's just it's pretty remarkable as someone, and I'm just going to say it bluntly, you're not a journalist. That's not your background. And yet your book has been cited over and over. You've achieved a level of kind of celebrity. I'm not, and
right.
Well, no, and I mean this sincerely, and I'm not trying to flatter you here, but it's a pretty remarkable turn in your life, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I think the thing that did it was really that I was bringing to light an area that people knew nothing about. I mean, people just,
but that they knew it was important.
They knew it was important, but they really didn't know anything about it. And when people were when the guys from ISO New England come to talk to the Energy Committee for an hour or two, the Energy Committee is usually left as puzzled. I mean, not because the guys from ISO New England aren't trying to communicate, they are, but because it's complicated and people end up just being sort of puzzled. There's something going on. They don't know quite what it is. They don't know why they don't know quite what it is. The fact that there are no sunshine laws on the grid, they don't have to tell you, is something that I emphasize in the book. And anyway, so it has been very interesting. There's a I guess it's a blog. It's called Manhattan Contrarian. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Anyway, Manhattan Contrarian, I don't agree with a lot of things they say, but they're very good about energy. I mean, this is my opinion, okay? And they're very good about energy things. And one of the things that he had a recent blog post about was an analysis of some of the Build Back Better things and who had actually done the good analysis of it. And he said, interestingly, the three good analysis were all done by retired engineers.
Huh.
And now why retired engineers? Well, the thing is, they have the background to look at it, and they don't have a boss to satisfy.
No career, no career risk.
No career risk. There's no career risk. They can say the absolute truth. What they do the calculation, and if the calculation comes back that everything's going to heck and the politicians are lying to you, nobody's going to fire them. Nobody's going to say, well, our company looks pretty bad when you write that. They just write it.
That's interesting. I need to look that up. I know Francis Minton is the writer at Manhattan Contrarian. But but congratulations on your success. I won't dwell on that, but it's just been remarkable to see how you've gained traction in this very wonky field. But it was all, I think, partly because you just had to write the book. It was, I've talked to a lot of people who said, oh, I want to write a book. I said, well, unless you have a absolute hair on fire desire to do it, don't, because it's an unbelievably painful process.
It is. And there's so many different aspects of it that can be painful. Like, for example, there's the structure of the book. I mean, exactly what do I want to say? I mean, there were sections of the book that I wrote and I decided, no, you got off track here, and I threw them away. I mean, thousands of words.
And it's painful. Yeah.
It's very painful. But I mean, I wanted it to have a coherence. And the thing is that as a human, I mean, I don't have that. Don't have complete coherence. So I went off on a tangent about something and I thought it was really important and I looked things up and then I thought, No, it won't move the boat forward. So, yeah, you really have to be dedicated to doing it. But once you are dedicated to doing it, at least in my case, it was a very enjoyable in many ways because, for example, when I was writing my blog, I'd write something and then the next day something, you know, meanwhile in another part of the forest, you know, and I'd have to switch,
Right.
you know, to whatever that was because it was in the news or, and, uh, and this time I could just go like, okay, you can follow this out. You can follow this out. You can look at the rulings. You can go deep on this one because it's a really good example. And that was a pleasure. I mean, the whole writing thing was in many ways extremely painful because it you know when I began writing it, I had no idea how long it was going to end up taking me. I mean, it took me years, and but there was a lot of pleasure in crafting the important parts. At least
Sure.
that's how I felt about it.
Yeah. Well, I think we can both agree that with that old line, it's better to have written.
Yes, yes, yes.
So,
Writing it.
yeah, but the writing is hard. So we've talked a little bit about Europe, and maybe we can come back to Europe. But I want to, we started with Texas, and to me, what's critical now in thinking about the U.S. electric grid as a whole, which is not, it's not a whole. It's a very diffused and very segregated bunch of different entities and different RTOs, state organizations, and so on. What do you think of the Biden administration's plans for the grid, where they say they will decarbonize the whole grid by 2035, get rid of all coal, all natural gas? Is this even plausible? What's your take on how the national discussion is going, and particularly with some of the climate activist groups and the ones who are saying we need to electrify everything? What's your take on that push?
Well, the first thing is that electrify everything is, in my opinion, a very bad idea because people need backup. I mean, in other words, if you want to electrify everything and also give everybody in every kind of situation, including apartments, a little wood stove, okay. But if you can't manage that, maybe you shouldn't electrify everything because otherwise people are going to be really stuck when there's no electricity. And, that's one thing. The other thing is that it is, I think the idea is that you're going to make these big plans and people are going to be excited about it. And so there's going to be a feeling that the country is moving forward and so forth by making such big and quick plans. But I think there's a danger in that because if the plans really can't be done, then there's going to be a reckoning. And I don't think that people are going to be happy. At the worst, they're just going to feel like they were fooled, that they devoted to something that couldn't be done. Or the bad news is they could decide that it couldn't be done because of those bad people over there, the Republicans, the Democrats, the Southerners,
Yeah.
the Northerners, the people who are in the oil and gas industry, the people that are in the renewables industry. There'll be some group that everybody will be on their case.
Well, so why is that idea so popular then? Because there is a lot, and I do mean a lot of money and momentum behind the groups that are pushing this agenda. What's driving it?
Well, I mean, I'm not a political commentator, but I can say that when I started out my career, I really wanted to be in renewables, and I went into the renewables, and I just thought they were so great because they were renewable, and one thing about a renewable setup in general is that you don't have fuel being delivered. There are no coal trains, there are no pipelines, and I mean, it's a very appealing idea, and it would be an appealing reality if they were steady enough and there was enough of them. but that isn't. And and I also think that we have this sort of we can do anything feeling, and it isn't that we shouldn't have it, but we are not actually gods and supermen. We are bound by laws of physics. We are bound by how much money we have. Deficit spending at really huge levels often doesn't end well. I mean, I'm just saying we should be, who knows what we should be. I think that having achievable goals is really important, and having goals that aren't achievable is very unlikely to lead to long-term happiness. I mean, I don't know.
Well, let me go back to Europe then, because this seems to be this unachievable goals. The as I put it, why is Europe heading toward the energy ditch? Too much investment in renewables and not enough investment in hydrocarbons and traditional generation. Is that that they've staked too much of their future on weather-dependent renewables? Is that how do you see the European crisis?
Well, there's all kinds of things going on in Europe. I mean, it's in a bunch of countries. We've got France that was being kind of pushed around by neighboring countries to close down some of their nuclear plants, and was getting a lot of kind of pushback that anybody who had that many nuclear plants was probably endangering the whole continent. And they've kept their nuclear plants, but the thing is, it's only recently that they decided to add some.
Right. Yeah.
Before that, it was
the crisis sure seemed to clarify their thinking on this, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and then you have Germany that has I don't know how to put it, a very romantic view of how it's going to live. It's going to be, everybody's going to be in their little enclave with their private wind turbine, and they're not going to be dependent on other people. I don't know. I don't understand the whole German thing about why they wanted to get rid of nuclear and are happy to keep coal. I mean, I can't get my mind around it, so I don't. And then we've got Poland that is eager to get away from coal and go to nuclear. So that's nice. So Europe isn't unified choices, and I don't know why, though, Germany has managed to put itself into the position of the moral leader on energy. It isn't a moral leader on energy in my books. Anybody who's digging up that many villages to get coal and shutting down nuclear plants isn't a moral leader, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I don't get it. I mean, I just really don't get it. And the fact that now there's so many, very, very prominent and powerful environmental groups, or activist groups. I've quit calling them environmental groups. Activist groups in the U.S. pushing to emulate Europe's policies in the wake of these disasters that are ongoing, and the crises ongoing, and also the crises in Texas and California. So I'm talking to my friend Meredith Angwin. She's the author of Shorting the Grid, the hidden fragility of our electric grid. You can find her on Twitter at Meredith Angwin, and her website is meredithangwin.com. So are you planning to write another book, Meredith? What people ask me this, so I'm going to ask you, and I hate that question, but I'm.
Well, I have an idea for another book, but at this point, I don't feel like I have the ability to write it. What I mean by that is that I don't know how to manage my time well enough to put the time away to write it. I'm on a lot of podcasts. in the last few days, I mean, I gave my course on the grid, and I was on the Connecticut legislator thing with Gordon Wiley, and then we had I also a bunch of people from Dartmouth, class at Dartmouth wanted to interview me, and I mean, I love it. It's fun to get the word out all this way, but I would have to sort of say, okay, I'm not doing this stuff anymore because I really have to write, and writing really takes everything I have. It just takes everything I have. I have to keep in mind the structure. I have to keep in mind where one little thing could be objected to. Like, for example, maybe I'm writing about inverter problems on the grid, and then I think, okay, you better be sure about this because somebody's going to look it up, and or somebody who knows a solar guy is going to be really upset. And, so I, from the biggest structure to the smallest detail, it just takes a lot of thinking. And I can't seem to do that thinking unless I stop doing interviews and stop,
Sure.
all that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, that rhymes with what, my experience is that I have to have large blocks of unstructured free time, and I can't even, a few phone calls or a few things that are interrupting the day. It just kind of like, I can't quite do it. Well, so we've been talking for close to an hour, Meredith, and I appreciate you coming back now on the podcast. We've talked many times in the year since the blackouts hit Texas. So is the cure, just a couple of more questions and then we'll stop, but is the cure for Texas then to incent part of the cure then to incent on-site fuel for power plants? So is that one of the ways to ensure resilience and reliability?
That would be absolutely great, and it would work pretty darn well. And Texas can actually do it because Texas doesn't have to be fuel neutral because it's not under FERC, it's not multi-state. Nobody can object to. Texas could refuse to build coal plants, refuse to build nuclear plants. It could refuse to build wind turbines. It could incent fuel on site. It can do all these things because it's a state. I mean, I don't want them to refuse to build nuclear plants or coal plants or whatever. I'm just saying that it's a state and it can do these things.
Because FERC can't intervene, and the state and the RTO are the same.
And the other thing is that if you have a state, it will tell you that anybody will say, well, resource adequacy is the state's business. Unfortunately, in an RTO area, it may be the state's business, but the state hasn't got the power to do everything about it. But in Texas, the state does have the power, at least as far as I can tell. The Texas can say, we're doing resource adequacy here, and we're doing it right. We're incenting people to keep fuel on site.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things that I think is clear, but it's the legislature. Well, you saw probably Berkshire Hathaway Energy approach the state and said, well, we'll build a bunch of power plants. We'll store fuel on site. Just, pay us $10 billion or something like that. It was on that order. And the state said, well, yeah, no, thank you, and go away. So just a last couple of things, Meredith. I asked these questions. What are you reading now? We both are busy a lot, but what are you reading? What's caught your attention lately?
Well, I was so happy that you asked this question because usually I don't know what to say. I read all sorts of things and then I'm like, what? But I'm very proud to say that I just finished reading Václav Smel's Energy and Civilization.
Oh, right.
It's a really long book.
Yes.
It's sort of like having finished War and Peace. So I'm going to say that I just finished reading that book, and it was very, it was the kind of thing that was, at first I thought, oh no, it's just going on. And then I realized that he was like a Pontilus painting all these little dots, and then it ended up with the picture. And it took me a while to, I mean, we're going through, for example, in Energy and Civilization, how much could a Roman horse pull compared to a medieval horse compared to a modern horse? How much horsepower do these different horses at different times of society have? And, there's a part of me that's going like, do I really need to know this? But then I realized that the point he's making is that we have perpetually, not just the Industrial Revolution or anything, we are perpetually trying, humans, to get more energy to accomplish our needs. If it's breeding bigger horses, inventing a better plow, using seed drills, we're trying to get more energy for our needs all the time. And all of a sudden I thought, well, that's the point. It isn't just the different horse harnesses, and it isn't just all the little minutiae that he, mentions. It is the whole picture. And so I'm very pleased that I read it, and I'm pleased that I finished it, and I'm not reading it again. I'm not going to sit down and reread it.
Well, that's interesting. I like your point there, the Pointillist. So I haven't made that connection before, but Václav Smil is the George Seurat of the of the
yes,
energy
I'm sorry,
world.
I didn't say his name right. Thank you for saying
no problem. But if you want another book by Smil that I think is actually his best book, it is the inventions that made the 21st century. I'm messing up the title, but it's a fairly short book, but it's
I like that.
It's very good. Excellent. I'm a big fan of Václav Smil, and I've met him once, and he's an interesting character. I should probably have him on the podcast. But he's also, not an optimist. I would put it to put it mildly. So the last question then, Meredith, what gives you hope? I mean, we've talked many times. I've asked you this question now on all the other 3 times you've been on the podcast, but I would say your life has changed a lot in the last, year and a half. What gives you hope these days?
Well, it's hard for me to tell what parts of my hope are because my life has changed and what parts of my hope are because the world has changed. And what I mean by that is I am getting a lot more invitations, like to talk to a student group at Dartmouth. They've never done that before. I've been five miles from Dartmouth for the past umpteen years, to talk to a legislative committee. I don't want to just begin going through some list of where Meredith has been invited, but it is interesting to me that so many people are interested in the topic of the grid. Or another thing, for example, our friend Emmett Penny, he was Nuke Barbarian, and now he has begun a new thing, a new blog, I guess it is.
Grid Brief, yeah.
Yeah, Grid Brief. And all of a sudden people are looking at the grid, and many of them are using terms that I'm pretty sure they learned in my book. I mean, I can't guarantee it, but as far as I know, it's the only book out there with some of those descriptions in it. And I just so it gives me hope that people are paying attention to the grid and not just kind of like, I love nuclear. No, I hate nuclear. I love solar. No, I hate solar. They're looking at it as an orchestra, which is what it is. It's a big thing that has to work together. And I just really like to see so many things that are grid oriented coming up. And of course, I like to be invited to them too. But even if I'm not particularly invited, I'm like, okay. Because look, I might write another book. I might not write another book. I might clear my schedule or I might not. But it pleases me that there might be other people who will write books about the grid and how it's being managed. You might say, oh, there'll be rivals. I'm not worried about rivals. I'm not trying to become rich on having written this book. I'm just saying I want it to be a new topic, and I think it's getting there.
I really like what you said about the grid as an orchestra, because I've thought about that, excuse me, that one of the failings of policymakers is that their lack of understanding of seeing the grid as a complex system, as a complex network, and
Yes.
that it has to be understood as a complex system and a complex network that cannot be allowed to fail, that it just has got to be 100% reliable, and everything else is second to that command. But you have to understand it as a complex network first before you can kind of get your mind around that, is my bias. But I like your idea of the orchestra better because or equally well, because it implies the need to create a coherent sound, or a signal, I guess, if we're going to really,
Right.
at 60 hertz.
Yes. And coherent and very steady and very reliable. And that's really important. I mean, if it begins dropping below 60 hertz, things can go bad.
Or gets below 59.4 hertz as it did at 2 a.m. on February 15th, 2021.
Yeah.
Yes, we could have some very bad things happen. Well, listen, Meredith, it's always great to talk to you. My guest again has been Meredith Angwin. She's the author of Shorting the Grid, the hidden fragility of our electric grid. You can find her easily on the interweb, meredithangwin.com, or at Meredith Angwin on Twitter. Meredith, thanks again for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.